Now what we're going to do is we're going to write our first test, which is going to render this touchable opacity, and to make sure that, yes, we can find a touchable opacity inside this button component. But the first thing we need to do is we need to go ahead and we need to have a rendered version of this component. So what I mean is, let's go ahead and define a wrapper. And inside this rendering block, let's write it before each block. And inside this before each block, we can go ahead and write wrapper equals shallow. And let's render that button component that we have. What we're doing here is we're defining that wrapper as a shallow render version of that button. So now, if we want to check any functionality or the rendering of this button, we can use that shallow render to check. So the first thing we can do is use that inside this touchable opacity. So we can go ahead and say expect wrapper to find a touchable opacity to have length of 1. Now let's go ahead and save it, and we're going to see what happens. You're going to notice that, yes, it failed. The reason why it failed is we expected to have 1, and we received 0. This is great news. We always want to see tests fail before it passes, because when a test fails, this is great. We know that it's not giving us a false positive. A false positive is even when we're wrong, it tells us that we're right. And we don't want any yes men around us. We want to be able to say definitively that our code is working and we test that backend. So now what we do, after we written this test, we had it fail. Now we want to go inside the button component and make it pass. So what we can do here is start defining this button component. So let's go ahead and say touchable opacity. And let's just define a little touchable opacity and nothing too much besides that. So let's save this, see what happens. We're running our test again. Voila, our tests are passing. So our first test is passed. So this is great news. We have one of these tests that is going good, and now we want to keep up with that success. So we have one going. Let's try the next one. So now let's go ahead and say it should render a label. So what we can do here is you say expect wrapper to find a text component inside of here. And we want to make sure that inside the text, it contains the words submit. And we want what we just said to be true. Let's save it, and we're going to watch it fail again. So notice how we have one failed, one passed. So let's take a look. Should render a label. Rendering should render a label. We expected it to be true, but we got false. So now let's go back here, and what we're going to do is we're going to try and make it pass again. So what we can do inside here is let's go ahead and take that text and let's go ahead and add a prop inside this component of label. And we're going to say, yes, there's a label. So now we can feed down into this component whatever we want the label to be. And then what we can do next is we can say button.prop types equals this, an empty object. And we're going to lay out that label. We're going to expect the prop type of this to be string. And this is going to be required. Now, I also like to add default props. And default props help us be able to provide a default value to make sure that this component, regardless of whether people put in a prop, will have that prop defined. So we don't have any nulls or nils or undefined. Let's go ahead and say button.defaultProps equals another empty object. And here, what we're going to do is define label as submit. Let's save this, see what our tests are going to do. And now we have 2 tests passing, which is great. Now, I always like to do something where we create just test props that we can feed into these components. So what we can do here is go to the top, and we're going to go ahead and write a little function, const create test props equals this little just a little mock, and we're going to say onClick is going to be just nothing. We're going to say label is submit, and we're going to say type is default. So what we can do now with these props is we can go ahead and feed it in. So we can go ahead and say inside the shallow, we can just say create test props. And go ahead and just do a spread operator and feed them in. And you should make sure that nothing's wrong with your test. So still, we're good, we're passing. So now that we have these 2 tests passing, let's go ahead and do one where we're defining what the style is. So over here, we have it should have a default style. So let's go ahead and define what that test looks like. So what we can do is we can say expect wrapper to find touchable opacity, and then we're going to find that component first, and we're going to grab the prop inside of it of style, and we want that to be styles.default. So do you remember how we imported the styles from up here? We have a little styles inside of here. We have a default styling. We just want to make sure that when there's nothing here, that style is going to be the default style if nothing is provided. So let's see over here. Our test failed, and that's good. We always want to see our test failed. We expected an object, but we got undefined. So how can we make this test pass? So the way we can make this test pass is by going inside of here, and we're going to just go ahead and define like a very basic style where you're just going to say the background color is papaya whip, and when the touchable opacity is present, we want that style to be styles.type. And of course, what we want to do next is go ahead and define that type in the default props as default. And then over here in the prop types, let's say type is going to be a prop types of one of either default or primary, and it's also going to be a required field. So it'll provide options on which one it could be. It's going to be either one of default or primary. So we got to add the type at the top. Let's go ahead and save that. And now that we're passing in the prop of type, feed it in, we see that the test is passing. So now what we want to do is test this other style block. Should have a primary type. And what we can do to test it is let's go ahead and go inside of there. We're going to go and say before each, we're going to say wrapper equals shallow. Let's go ahead and define our button again. And what we're going to do is we're just going to say the label equals submit. And we're going to say the type is primary. So now that we have this, let's go ahead and write this test we're going to check what happens when the type becomes primary. So we're going to say expect wrapper to find touchable opacity. Where we're going to go ahead and say the prop of style like we did in the previous one. And we're going to expect it to be styles.primary. Save that. See what happens in our test suite. You're going to notice that it passed. And the reason why it passed is because we did the legwork in our previous step. We basically went ahead and we defined the style.types. We basically fed it whatever. Let's go ahead and go inside this page, and we're going to just define a random color. We're just going to say the background color is pink. So now that our styling is done, what we want to do next is be able to go and test some of the interactions. We want to make sure that there is something that's going to happen when we click it. So let's go ahead and write our before each block again. And what we're going to do inside here is going to define what the props is. We're going to say the label is submit. And we're going to say the unclick is a Jess function. So you might be wondering at this point, what is a Jess function? And basically Jess functions are a spy that wraps around a normal function that it allows us to inspect how many times this thing was called. So it becomes really useful for us. Again, we're going to use a shallow render and we're going to provide the new props that we wrote into it. So now that we have this, our little setup done, what we can do is we can write our test. Here, we're going to say before each. Again, we're going to say wrapper.find touchable opacity prop on press. We're going to go ahead and just click on that touchable opacity, and inside here we should be able to see that expect props dot unclick to have been called times, and the number of times will just be 1. Save this, and we're going to see it fail. So notice that it failed. It should have been called 1 time, but it was called 0 times. So how do we get past that? Well, the first thing we do is we go inside of our component again, and we're going to provide a very simple little function of unclick into the button. And now what we're going to do is we're going to say whenever when the button is pressed, we're going to call that unclick function. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the prop types is defined. So we're going to say unclick the prop types .func that is required. So we're going to make sure that function is there. And then the next thing we're going to do is going to provide the default props, and we're going to say unclick equals an empty function when there's nothing provided. So now we save it, we go back to our test. I'm going to notice that our test is passing. This is great news for us. Able to make sure our UI is rendered correctly. And what we can do is do a snapshot test. So let's go ahead and open that block. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and say const tree equals, and we're going to use that render library, which is going to help us take a snapshot. We're going to say render dot, and we're going to say create. Let's just plug in the button that we have, and we're going to say to JSON. So it's basically going to render that into JSON for us. We're going to expect the tree to match snapshot. Let's go ahead and save. Open the terminal. And you're going to notice that all our tests are passing in this component now. It's pretty easy, right?